In the humid swamps of North Carolina, where the air hung heavy with the scent of pine and sorrow, a man named Lazarus waited in silence. His hands, calloused and cracked from years of labor, gripped the handle of a rusted lantern. The faint light flickered across his dark, sweat-soaked face, revealing eyes that had long forgotten what mercy looked like. He was not born a monster, but the world that caged him had taught him how to become one. The year was 1834. A time when the South's wealth was built on the backs of broken men, and the cries of the enslaved were silenced beneath the hymns of church bells. Lazarus belonged to the Whitmore Plantation, a sprawling estate known for its fine tobacco, fields, and cruel reputation. Overseers carried whips like ornaments, and the master, Benjamin Whitmore, was a man who smiled while others screamed. Under his rule, the enslaved worked from before dawn until the moon was high. Those who faltered were punished not just in flesh, but in spirit. For Lazarus, life was a series of losses. His wife, Naomi, had been sold to a neighboring plantation 3 years earlier. His son, Eli, was beaten to death after trying to steal a loaf of bread from the kitchen. Lazarus buried him in secret near the swamp's edge, marking the grave with a single stone and a whispered promise, "I'll make them remember you." At first, he tried to survive by silence. He kept his head low, obeyed commands, and prayed that freedom would come through faith. But faith could not erase the screams that haunted his sleep. Faith could not unchain his brothers or return his son's laughter. And when the overseer, drunk and cruel, made sport of whipping an old man until he couldn't stand, something inside Lazarus began to shift. His soul, once patient, turned into something sharp. The fire that burned inside him was small at first, a flicker of rage that hid beneath obedience. But every lash, every insult, every stolen dream fed it until it became an inferno. The plan took shape slowly, like a shadow forming in moonlight. He watched the rhythms of the plantation, the patterns of the guards, the placement of the oil barrels, the way the wind carried the sparks from the smithy. He began stealing small things, a piece of cloth here, a bit of oil there. To others, it looked like desperation. To Lazarus, it was preparation. He whispered to no one, trusted no one, not even the ones who called him brother. The burden of vengeance was his alone to carry. On the night it happened, the sky was moonless. The fields shimmered with dew, and the cicadas screamed as if they knew what was coming. The masters were drunk from a harvest celebration, their laughter echoing from the main house. The enslaved lay silent in their quarters, too tired to dream. Lazarus moved like a shadow through the dark, carrying the oil-soaked rags he had hidden for weeks. When the first flame caught, it was small, just a whisper against the barn's dry wood. But within minutes, the fire roared, devouring the night in orange fury. The horses screamed, the men shouted, and the sky glowed red like the mouth of hell itself. By dawn, 9 of the Whitmore family were dead, burned alive as they tried to flee their collapsing mansion. The plantation that had stood as a monument to cruelty was nothing more than ash and ruin, and Lazarus, he was gone. No one saw where he fled. Some said he drowned in the swamp, others swore he turned into smoke and vanished with the wind. But among the enslaved across the South, his name spread like wildfire. They called him the Black Phoenix, the man who rose from chains to flame. His story became a whisper of power, a reminder that even the most broken man could strike fear into those who thought themselves gods. The white newspapers called him a beast, a murderer, a demon in human form. The church labeled his act blasphemy. But the enslaved remembered something else. They remembered the way the fire looked that night. It wasn't just destruction, it was freedom, even if only for a moment. It was justice in a world where none existed. It was Lazarus's revenge. And though the world tried to erase his name, the fire he started still burns in stories, in bloodlines, in the deep places of history, where truth refuses to die. Lazarus's story did not begin with fire. It began with chains, iron, invisible and unrelenting. Long before the night North Carolina burned, Lazarus had already been shaped by a lifetime of humiliation and loss. Every scar on his body told a story, and every silence he kept was a monument to pain. His vengeance was not born in madness, but in memory. To understand the man who would one day burn 9 masters alive, one must first understand what the world did to him before he ever touched the flame. Lazarus was born on the Whitmore Plantation in 1805, into a world that had already decided his worth. To his mother, Sarah, he was a blessing, a thin, wide-eyed baby with a strange quietness, as if even in infancy he was listening to the whispers of the wind. To his owner, he was property, a name in a ledger valued at $70. His mother was forced to leave him in the care of an older slave woman, Aunt Mira, while she worked in the fields from dawn till dusk. By the time he was 7, he had seen more death than most grown men. He saw a friend beaten to death for dropping a water bucket. He saw his mother whipped for singing a song that reminded her of home. He saw the overseer smile as blood dripped from her back, and in that moment, something small and cold took root inside him. When Lazarus turned 12, the overseers began teaching him a man's work. He was sent to the fields, handed a hoe, and told that sweat was the only prayer a slave should know. The older men taught him the rhythm of survival, when to bow, when to look away, when to stay silent. But they also taught him something else how to remember. Don't forget what they do to you. Old Isaac told him one night by the dying fire. Memory is the only weapon they can't take. Lazarus never forgot those words. Every wound became a story, every humiliation a lesson in what power looked like. His first taste of defiance came not from violence, but from love. He met Naomi when he was 20, a young woman from a nearby plantation. They would meet secretly in the woods, beneath a dying oak tree that bent like it was bowing to their secret. She told him stories her mother had told her, about Africa, about kings and queens, about spirits that walked through the fire unharmed. Lazarus didn't believe in spirits, but he believed in her. For the first time, he felt alive. They married in secret, using 2 pieces of straw tied together as rings. For a while, even in bondage, he found something that looked like freedom. But peace never lasted on the Whitmore plantation. One night, Naomi was caught sneaking back after meeting him. The overseer dragged her to the front yard and whipped her until her screams turned hoarse. Lazarus watched from the shadows, powerless, as the woman he loved crumbled into the dirt. Days later, she was sold to a trader heading south. He never saw her again. That night, something broke inside him. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just sat beneath the oak tree until the sun rose, whispering her name like a prayer. The years that followed hardened him. His body grew stronger, his heart colder. He became known as a worker who never complained, who took punishment without sound. The masters mistook his silence for obedience. They didn't see the way his eyes watched, the way his hands memorized every lock, every rote, every weak point in the wooden walls. To them, he was harmless. To himself, he was gathering strength, waiting for the day when silence would no longer be enough. When his son Eli was born years later from another enslaved woman, Lazarus felt that small flicker of hope again. The boy had Naomi's eyes wide and curious. He promised himself he would protect him no matter what, but fate was crueler than any whip. When Eli turned 8, he was caught stealing bread from the master's table. The overseer beat him so savagely that his tiny ribs snapped. By the time Lazarus found him behind the barn, his son was barely breathing. Eli's last words were a whisper. "Papa, I was hungry." He died in his father's arms before dawn. That night, Lazarus buried his son by the swamp. No coffin, no prayer, just earth and grief. As he covered the small body with dirt, he said the words that would define the rest of his life. "I will make them remember." That was the moment the fire inside him was born. It was not just rage, it was justice, twisted and desperate, the only kind the world had ever denied him. From that day forward, Lazarus stopped being a man and became a shadow. He worked like a machine, silent, unbreakable, patient. He began to study fire. He noticed how the dry leaves caught faster when soaked in oil, how the wind from the west spread flames quicker across the fields. He collected scraps of cloth, bits of oil, pieces of rope. It wasn't madness, it was method. Vengeance became his religion, and flame his only god. But what made Lazarus's story tragic wasn't just the violence he inflicted. It was the violence he inherited. The South created him, molded him, and when he finally turned on it, they called him evil. Yet what was evil but a reflection of their own cruelty? The masters who chained, whipped, and sold human beings could not see that the fire that destroyed them was the same fire they had been stoking for generations. By the time the Whitmore plantation burned, Lazarus was not acting out of impulse. He was fulfilling a prophecy written by every lash and every tear. The man they thought broken had become the reckoning they never imagined possible. The fire was not just destruction. It was memory made visible. Each flame that consumed the wood was a voice that had been silenced rising once more. In the ashes of that night, the world saw only horror. But among the enslaved, a legend was born. They said Lazarus's spirit still walked the swamps, watching, waiting, a reminder that even the most oppressed could rise. His vengeance was terrible, yes, but it was also the cry of centuries of pain finally answered. Lazarus's life was proof of one haunting truth. When a man is denied humanity long enough, he will take it back by any means necessary. And when he does, the fire he starts doesn't just burn the fields, it burns through history itself. The Whitmore Plantation stood on the outer edges of Rowan County, North Carolina, a sprawling empire of cruelty hidden behind white columns and magnolia trees. From a distance, it looked like every southern dream. Fields of cotton glowing gold beneath the sun, slaves moving in rhythm like shadows of the earth itself, and a mansion that seemed carved out of money. But beauty is a lie, and no place proved that more than Whitmore. Inside that house was rot, the kind that doesn't show in the wood, but in the people who walk on it. To understand what drove Lazarus to burn it all down, you must first step inside that world. The world that called itself civilization while practicing hell. The Whitmore family had ruled those acres for 3 generations. Their power wasn't just in wealth, it was in fear. Benjamin Whitmore, the master of the estate during Lazarus's time, had inherited not just the land, but his father's cruelty and his grandfather's arrogance. He was known for 2 things: his fine whiskey and his obsession with control. Every nail, every blade of grass, every living soul on his plantation belonged to him, and he made sure they never forgot it. Each morning began with the bell. Its clang echoed through the fields before dawn, dragging men and women from their shacks into the pale light. Overseers with whips waited like wolves. Work fast, pray slow, they'd bark. Prayer was allowed, as long as it didn't get in the way of cotton. The day stretched endlessly. The only rest came when the sun died. Even then, the fields whispered of misery. The Whitmore house was built like a temple of hypocrisy. It had polished floors, portraits of saints, and a library full of Bibles. But in the basement, beneath those same floors, there were chains and hooks and the stains of blood scrubbed 100 times but never forgotten. That's where Lazarus first learned what kind of God the Whitmores really worshipped. He was sent there at 15 to work the furnace. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and screams muffled by stone walls. He saw the overseers bring men down there and return alone. He didn't ask questions, he just stoked the fire and watched. But in that firelight, he began to understand something that changed him forever. The Whitmores feared rebellion more than death. Their power depended on silence, and silence depended on terror. There was one night he would never forget, the night they brought in a man named Tobias. Tobias was strong, too proud for his own good, and he'd been caught teaching others to read. For that, they beat him, tied him to the iron post, and burned him alive. Lazarus had to keep the fire going. The smell of burning flesh stayed in his nostrils for weeks. When Tobias screamed his last word, freedom, Lazarus turned away, but his heart didn't. That word stayed. It haunted him, buried itself deep like a coal waiting for air. The Whitmore women were no better. Miss Eleanor, the mistress, believed kindness was weakness. She'd call the house slaves, children, when guests were present, but when they made a mistake, she'd have them whipped by her husband. Her Sunday prayers were loudest when her sins were freshest. She once made Lazarus kneel for an hour holding a candle above his head because he spilled water on her dress. "You must learn balance," she said, smiling, while wax burned through his skin. But the true devil of Whitmore was the overseer, a man named Darius Shaw. Tall, scarred, and hollow-eyed, he had the soul of a serpent. He delighted in breaking men. He'd force slaves to fight each other for amusement, betting whiskey on who would fall first. He once dragged a woman from her cabin at night just to prove to others that he could. To him, pain wasn't punishment, it was pleasure. Under Shaw's rule, even the strongest men broke, but not Lazarus. He endured. He never raised his eyes, never spoke back. Shaw mistook it for weakness. It was patience. Every lash, every insult, every injustice. Lazarus stored them like dry wood. There were whispers about the plantation among the slaves. Some said it was cursed. Some said the soil drank too much blood to ever grow clean. Others claimed to see figures in the fields at night, ghosts of those who died there, walking through the rows of cotton like shadows in prayer. Lazarus didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in curses, because he was living one. One stormy night, he overheard a conversation that sealed his fate. hidden behind the stable. He listened as Whitmore bragged to Shaw about selling another group of slaves to cover his debts. "If they don't fetch enough," he said, laughing, "we'll send the useless ones to the pit. Cheaper than feeding them." The pit. Lazarus had seen it once, a mass grave behind the barn, filled with bodies too broken for burial. That was when he decided if he was to die, it wouldn't be in a pit. It would be in fire. The idea of burning the plantation didn't come from rage. It came from justice. The Whitmores had burned everything sacred, bodies, hope, even love. Fire was the only language they understood. It purified. It punished. It erased. In the months that followed, Lazarus became a shadow in his own world. He obeyed more strictly than ever, spoke softly, never drew attention. He learned where the oil was stored, how the winds shifted at night, which doors stayed unlocked. He noticed which candles burned quickest, which torches smoked most. The overseers saw a broken man. They never realized he was planning their end. The Whitmore plantation had survived famine, war, and drought, but it could not survive its own sins. Every night, as the stars blinked over the fields, Lazarus whispered to himself the same word Tobias had screamed in freedom. It wasn't a dream anymore. It was a promise. And when the time came, when the fires finally rose, the Whitmores would learn what it meant to live in the hell they created. The fire wouldn't just destroy their world. It would expose it. The flames that lit the sky that night would carry the cries of generations, the fury of every man and woman buried beneath the soil. Whitmore Plantation had been the cradle of cruelty. Soon, it would be its grave. Every man has a moment when he stops being human. For Lazarus, that moment came on a night heavy with rain, a night that smelled of iron, mud, and despair. It wasn't the first time he had watched someone die, nor would it be the last. But that night, he stopped being a man who endured and became a man who remembered. The difference between those two kinds of men is the distance between silence and fire. The rain had been falling since morning, drumming against the tin roofs of the slave quarters, turning the red Carolina soil into rivers of blood-colored mud. The fields were empty. The overseers stayed inside, cursing the weather, drinking their master's whiskey. For most, it was a rare night of quiet. But quiet on the Whitmore plantation never meant peace. It meant something was about to happen. Lazarus sat in his cabin, sharpening an old blade he used for cutting rope. He wasn't thinking about escape, not yet. He was thinking about Naomi, the wife he had lost to the trader's wagon years before. Sometimes, when the wind moved through the trees just right, he swore he could hear her voice, whispering his name through the rain. That memory was all he had left of tenderness. It kept him alive, and it hurt him more than the whip ever could. That night, a boy burst into his cabin. Samuel, a small, trembling child no older than 10. They caught him, he gasped. They caught Jacob. Jacob was Lazarus's oldest friend, a man built of muscle and quiet kindness. He had been planning something, maybe running away, maybe fighting back. No one knew. But now they didn't have to guess. Darius Shaw had found him with a map drawn in charcoal, showing a route through the swamps. By the time Lazarus reached the main yard, a crowd had already gathered. The rain fell harder, washing the dirt into rivers, but the overseers stood firm. Jacob was tied to the whipping post, shirt ripped open, back already bleeding. Shaw paced around him like a preacher before a sermon. "You think you're clever," he shouted. "You think you can run from the Lord's order." Jacob didn't answer. He just lifted his head, eyes half closed, mouth open in pain. Whitmore himself stepped out from the veranda, cigar glowing in the dark. "Make an example," he said coldly. What followed was not punishment. It was theater. The lash cut through rain and flesh alike, each strike echoing through the yard like thunder. The slaves watched in silence, their faces masks of grief and fear. Lazarus stood at the back, his hands clenched, nails digging into his palms. He had seen beatings before, but never like this. Shaw wasn't punishing Jacob. He was destroying him. When the overseer finally stopped, Jacob was barely breathing. Shaw dropped the whip, panting, and said, "Let him hang. Maybe his ghost will think twice before running again." 2 men dragged Jacob's limp body to the barn, looped a rope around his neck, and pulled. The sound, that final snap, cut through the rain like glass. Lazarus felt his stomach turn. The boy Samuel started to cry, but Lazarus put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't let them hear you." The crowd dispersed. The overseers laughed. Whitmore went back inside. The firelight from the house windows flickered like eyes watching them leave. Lazarus stayed behind, staring at Jacob's body swaying gently in the storm. He waited until the yard was empty. Then he walked up to his friend. Rain rolled down his face, mixing with tears he didn't even feel. "You were the best of us," he murmured, "and they killed you for wanting to breathe." He reached up, untied the rope, and let Jacob fall into his arms. For a long time he just held him. No prayer, no words, just silence. That silence broke something inside him. For years, Lazarus had lived by patience. He had believed that survival was victory, that every breath taken under a cruel master was defiance enough. But now, holding the dead weight of the only friend who had ever called him brother, he realized patience was just another form of death. They had killed his love. They had killed his son. Now they had killed his soul. When he buried Jacob near the swamp, he made a vow. He didn't speak it aloud, but the night heard it. The wind stopped. The rain paused. Even the frogs went silent. "You will burn," he whispered finally, pressing his hand into the wet earth. "All of you." After that night, Lazarus was different. The other slaves saw it in his eyes, that faraway look of a man who'd already crossed over to something else. He moved through the days like a ghost, his body there but his mind elsewhere. He worked harder, faster, never speaking unless spoken to. The overseers took it as submission. It wasn't. It was concentration. He began preparing, quietly, methodically. He started collecting bits of oilcloth from the barns, small pieces of metal, and bits of rope. When asked, he said they were for repairs. No one questioned him. He was invisible again, just another shadow among hundreds. At night, he studied fire. He learned how it moved, how it fed. He remembered how Tobias had burned in the furnace years ago, and how the flames had crawled like living things. He began to think of fire as alive, not destruction, but transformation. Fire didn't just kill, it cleansed, it spoke. He started whispering to others, those he trusted. "What if," he said softly one night, "the Master's house burned the way our hearts have burned?" Most were too afraid to listen. Some called him mad. But a few nodded, eyes wet with rage. The idea spread like sparks through dry fields. The breaking point wasn't just that night in the rain. It was everything that came before it. Every life lost, every silence forced, every prayer unanswered. Jacob's death was simply the last straw that turned grief into fury. By the time spring came, Lazarus had already planned everything. He knew where the oil was stored. He knew when the guards slept. He knew which direction the wind carried smoke fastest. All that remained was timing. The Whitmores thought they ruled the world. But what they didn't understand, what they could never understand, was that a man who has lost everything is no longer afraid of death. And that kind of man doesn't just fight back. He burns the world that enslaved him. There are nights that never end. Not because the sun fails to rise, but because the memory of them burns so fiercely that the light never fades. The night Lazarus set fire to the Whitmore plantation was one of those nights. It began with silence, the kind of heavy, waiting silence that seems to hold its breath before the storm. By dawn, 9 white masters would be dead, their screams swallowed by the flames, and Lazarus, the man who once bowed his head, would become a ghost whispered about for generations. The air that night was thick with the smell of rain and tobacco. The moon hung low over the Carolina woods, pale and swollen, like an unblinking eye. The slaves had finished their work early. The overseers drank themselves to sleep inside the main house, laughing about nothing. The dogs were chained, their barks muffled by the distance. Every piece of the night seemed to fall into place, as if the world itself was conspiring with Lazarus. He moved quietly through the shadows, carrying a small sack slung across his back. Inside were bottles filled with oil, bits of rag twisted into wicks, and a single matchbox wrapped in cloth to keep it dry. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Behind him, 3 other men followed. Samuel, now older and harder, Jacob's brother Eli, and Ruth, a woman whose husband had been whipped to death just weeks before. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They all knew what this night meant. Lazarus stopped near the edge of the barn, where the smell of hay and horses was strongest. "Once it starts," he whispered, "don't stop. Don't look back." Ruth nodded, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. "We'll be gone before the screams begin." He handed each of them a bottle. The rags were soaked in oil, heavy and dark. "This isn't for revenge," Lazarus said quietly. "It's for freedom." for every soul they buried without a name. He turned to face the main house, the grand, white plantation home that had stood like a symbol of power for decades. Its windows glowed faintly, the flicker of candlelight inside making it look almost peaceful. But Lazarus knew better. Every inch of that house was built on blood. He walked toward it slowly, each step echoing softly in the wet grass. The night insects hummed. The frogs croaked in the swamp beyond. Even the wind seemed to move in time with his heartbeat. When he reached the porch, he paused, listening. From inside came the sound of a piano, a soft, lazy tune played by Miss Whitmore before she went to bed. The melody was light and fragile, completely unaware of what was coming. He uncorked the first bottle, stuffed the rag deeper into the neck, and set it down by the door. The smell of oil filled the air. Ruth and Ale did the same along the side of the house, near the wooden beams that held the veranda. Samuel, silent as smoke, slipped toward the stables. When everything was in place, Lazarus struck the match. For a moment, nothing existed but that tiny flame, a trembling, golden thing that reflected in his eyes. Then he touched it to the rag. The fire caught instantly. The flame crawled along the cloth, kissed the wood, and began to spread, slow at first, then faster, feeding on the dry paint and the wind. Within seconds, the doorway was alive with orange light. The piano stopped. Lazarus stepped back. He watched the fire climb the porch rails, leap to the windows, and burst into the curtains inside. A woman screamed. The sound cut through the night like a knife. Then another scream joined it, and another. The others began to run. Ruth headed for the woods, clutching her shawl. Samuel was already gone, his small figure vanishing into the darkness. But Lazarus stayed, all of it. The doors flew open. Darius Shaw stumbled out first, half-dressed, eyes wild. "Fire!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Behind him came Whitmore himself, coughing, his white shirt glowing orange in the light. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, the master and the slave. The world froze. Whitmore took a step forward, recognizing the face in the shadows. "You," he started, but the word never finished. The roof cracked. Flames shot upward, roaring like thunder. Lazarus turned and walked away, his shadow stretching long and thin across the ground. By the time the house collapsed, the entire plantation was burning. The barn, the stables, the storage sheds, all swallowed by flame. Horses screamed. Men ran in circles, their clothes on fire. The night sky turned red. From the woods, Ruth looked back once. She saw Lazarus standing on the hill, watching it all with an expression that wasn't joy or sorrow, just finality. She called his name, but he didn't answer. He walked to the small cemetery behind the fields, where unmarked graves stretched beneath the trees. He knelt there, beside the spot where Jacob lay, and whispered, "They're free now." The heat from the fire reached even there, warm and fierce. It felt almost holy. By morning, the plantation was nothing but ash. 9 men, Whitmore, his sons, and 7 overseers, were found charred beyond recognition. Their wealth, their home, their legacy, all gone. The slaves who survived disappeared into the swamps and forests, following routes whispered about for years but never dared attempted. As for Lazarus, no one ever saw him again. Some said he drowned crossing the river. Others swore he was taken by bounty hunters and hanged. But the old folks told another story, that he lived far up north under a new name, and that sometimes when fires burned too brightly, people could still see his shadow in the smoke. They said the fire wasn't just vengeance. It was a message, a voice for the dead, a warning for the living. And from that night on, every plantation in North Carolina carried the same unspoken fear that somewhere, among the people they called slaves, another Lazarus was waiting, a man who would rise from the ashes, a man who would burn the world that tried to bury him. When the dawn rose over North Carolina the morning after the fire, the sky was painted in gray ash and faint streaks of gold. The Whitmore plantation, once a symbol of wealth and domination, was reduced to smoldering ruins. Smoke still curled from the blackened skeletons of buildings, and the air reeked of burned wood. Flesh and iron, crows circled overhead, their harsh cries echoing across the silent fields. The fire that Lazarus had lit did not just destroy a plantation, it set the South trembling. Word of the inferno spread faster than the flames themselves. By noon, riders had reached neighboring towns, bringing news of the massacre. 9 white men, planters and overseers, were dead. Their bodies had been pulled from the wreckage, twisted and unrecognizable, a grotesque contrast to the power they once wielded. Among the locals, Fear turned into fury. Rumors swirl a slave rebellion, a curse, or even the devil himself walking among the enslaved. The surviving slaves from the Whitmore plantation were nowhere to be found. Entire quarters stood empty, beds untouched, tools left in the fields. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Men with rifles combed the woods and riverbanks, following footprints that disappeared into mud and reeds. Some swore they found traces. A shawl caught on a branch, a footprint near the river. But Lazarus and his companions had vanished like ghosts. Yet though he was gone, his presence lingered. In the burned soil where the mansion once stood, people claimed strange things happened. At night, smoke rose from the ground, glowing faintly red. Those who passed by after dark said they heard voices, whispers in the ash, as though the dead were retelling their final screams. A preacher from a nearby town declared it a sign of divine wrath. "The Lord has sent his judgment," he said, "and it came through the hands of those who have suffered longest." But among the enslaved communities, a different kind of whisper spread, one filled not with fear, but with awe. They called him Lazarus of the Flames. In the slave quarters across Carolina and Virginia, the story took on a life of its own. Some said he had been born with fire in his blood, that his mother had dreamt of a red star before he was born. Others said he had spoken to the spirits of the dead before setting the blaze, asking for their blessing. Mothers told their children that Lazarus had freed the souls of the enslaved buried beneath the fields, that he had opened a path north through the smoke. The rebellion that masters feared for decades had not begun in armies or speeches. It began with one man and a match. Weeks passed, and the authorities grew desperate to find the culprits. Posters went up in nearby towns, wanted the Negro called Lazarus for the crime of murder and arson. Rewards were promised, dogs were unleashed, and patrols swept through the countryside. They found nothing. Then, 1 month later, in the town of Fayetteville, a drifter arrived at a tavern claiming he'd seen Lazarus crossing the Cape Fear River. He said the man was alive, wearing a white preacher's coat, carrying a Bible scorched at the edges. He spoke like a man who'd seen hell. The drifter whispered, and walked right out of it. The story spread like wildfire. Some believed it, others mocked it. But fear had already taken root, not fear of one man, but of what he represented. If one slave could destroy an entire plantation, what stopped others from doing the same? In response, plantation owners began sleeping with pistols under their pillows. Patrols were doubled, laws grew harsher. But the more they tried to control, the more unrest festered beneath the surface. The fire Lazarus lit was no longer confined to wood and timber. It burned in the hearts of those who'd seen what courage could do. By the winter of 1842, songs were being sung in secret, soft, mournful hymns that carried Lazarus's name. One such song, recorded decades later by freedmen, went like this: "Ashes to ashes, dust to flame, Lazarus rose and called their names. 9 men burned for 9 long years, freedom spoke through smoke and tears." Those who sang it did so quietly, afraid of being heard. But with each verse, the legend grew stronger. Lazarus became less a man and more a symbol, a spirit of vengeance and deliverance. And yet, there were whispers of his survival that refused to die. Some said he'd made it north, changing his name to Samuel Price and preaching under a false identity. Others claimed he joined an early network of abolitionists, helping escaped slaves reach freedom through hidden routes. In one story, a freedwoman in Ohio told of a tall man with burned scars on his hands who built a small church for runaway slaves. A man who never spoke of his past but flinched at the sound of crackling fire. Whether true or imagined, these stories mattered more than fact. They gave hope and fear, depending on who was listening. In time, the name Lazarus became forbidden in the South. Plantation owners banned their slaves from speaking it, but you cannot ban a whisper. Around campfires, in hushed gatherings, they spoke of him anyway, the man who burned 9 masters alive and never looked back. Years later, during the Civil War, Black Union soldiers from North Carolina were said to carve his name on their rifles. For Lazarus, they'd murmur before charging into battle. For them, his fire had never gone out. It had simply changed form, turning from flame to faith, from vengeance to freedom. And even long after the war, when slavery had ended and the plantations stood abandoned, people claimed that sometimes, on hot summer nights, when the air was thick and the moon hung low, the ashes near the old Whitmore land would stir again, glowing faintly as if remembering. They said if you stood there in silence long enough, you could still smell the smoke, hear the piano's final note, and feel the heat of Lazarus's vengeance in the wind. He had become eternal, not in body, but in story. Lazarus's revenge was never just about death. It was about reclaiming a soul the world tried to bury. It was about fire as both destruction and rebirth, the burning of chains and the forging of freedom. For in the ashes of that terrible night, something powerful had risen, something that no whip, no master, and no law could ever silence again. The fire of one man had become the flame of a people. After the ashes settled over Whitmore Plantation, and the smoke faded into the Carolina sky, the story of Lazarus refused to die. It spread first in hushed tones among the enslaved, whispered at night, sung softly over cotton fields, retold in candlelit cabins as though invoking a spirit. Yet within months, the tale crossed borders and classes. What began as a rumor of one man's rebellion became something far larger, a haunting legend that stitched itself into the fabric of the South, reshaping both fear and faith in its path. For the enslaved, Lazarus was no longer a man of flesh and blood. He was the living embodiment of justice denied for generations. His name was a prayer, a warning, and a hope all at once. Lazarus rose, they said, and in that simple phrase lay an entire theology of freedom. In a world where hope had been crushed, here was a man who had defied everything: the whip, the law, even death itself. He had risen from bondage, burned his masters alive, and vanished into legend. The story gave the enslaved people something: dangerous belief. By the late 1840s, slave patrols and plantation owners were reporting increased unrest. Songs were being sung that officials called rebellious hymns. Children were named Lazarus in secret. Some mothers whispered that if their sons ever faced the lash, they should remember the man who turned fire into a weapon. Others used his name to frighten overseers. Careful now, Lazarus is watching. The white South reacted with equal parts terror and denial. Local newspapers avoided printing the name, but plantation talk was filled with it. Ministers called him a demon, born from the pits of hell. Pamphlets circulated claiming that the fire at Whitmore Plantation was the work of Satan's servant in black skin. Yet no matter how they twisted the story, fear clung to their every word, because deep down, they understood what the legend meant: that their empire of control could be shattered by a single slave's will. In one account, a preacher in Raleigh gave a sermon titled, "The Devil's Fire in Carolina." He warned that sin and rebellion were spreading among the enslaved, that the fires of Lazarus would consume all who strayed from obedience. But even his warning only added fuel to the myth. For every master who trembled in fear of him, a slave somewhere whispered his name like scripture. By 1850, the tale had crossed state lines. In Virginia, a runaway slave recited it to a journalist from the New York Tribune, describing a man named Lazarus who burned the wick to free the good. The journalist thought it a superstition, but when he published the account, readers in the North were captivated. Abolitionists seized upon it, seeing in Lazarus the symbol of every enslaved man's righteous fury. Pamphlets began to appear in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, illustrated with woodcuts of a black man holding a torch before a burning mansion. The caption beneath often read, "Lazarus, Fire of the South." It was both propaganda and prophecy. For the first time, Northern readers looked upon an enslaved man not merely as a victim, but as an avenger. The moral landscape of the era shifted, one whisper at a time. Meanwhile, down in North Carolina, people still claimed to see him. There were sightings of a tall man with burned scars who walked the forests by night. Children said he appeared near old plantations, warning the enslaved to flee before the chains turned to smoke. Others swore they saw him crossing rivers under the moonlight, carrying a bundle wrapped in a preacher's cloak. None could prove it, but each sighting kept the fear alive and the legend burning. Even among those who didn't believe, his story haunted their dreams. Wives of plantation owners claimed to smell smoke when there was no fire. Overseers jumped at the crack of thunder, mistaking it for gunfire. Some plantations even banned candles at night, fearing another Lazarus flame, but legends have a way of growing with time, and soon they took on supernatural colors. By 1860, tales of the Lazarus fire became ghost stories told in whispers. People said that if you stood on the ruins of Whitmore Plantation at midnight, you could see 9 ghostly figures burning and a shadow watching from the trees. They said the fire could never be put out because it wasn't just made of wood and air. It was made of vengeance. For the enslaved, though, the legend wasn't about ghosts or curses. It was about courage, the kind that came from desperation and dignity. When the Civil War began, and enslaved men joined the Union Army, some painted small torches on their rifles. Officers recorded hearing men chant before battle, "For Lazarus!" For the fire that never dies. In the decades after the war, the story evolved again. Freedmen told their children of the man who refused to bow. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance rediscovered him, reimagining Lazarus not as a killer, but as a symbol of divine retribution, the biblical Lazarus reborn in the flesh of the oppressed. To them, his act of destruction was also an act of creation, burning away an old, wicked world so a new one could rise from its ashes. Even historians of the early 20th century, combing through slave narratives, found traces of the story hidden in folklore collections. In one account from 1923, an elderly woman named Ruthie Miles from Wilmington told an interviewer, "Wu had a man long before my time, who set the world right with fire. They say his name was Lazarus. They say he burned 9 men and freed 9 souls. We still sing his song when the moon is low." Her voice trembled when she spoke it, as if she still felt the heat. Today, what remains of Lazarus's story lies between myth and memory. Historians debate whether he truly existed or was a composite of several acts of rebellion. But truth and legend have long since fused. What matters most is what he came to represent, the voice of the voiceless, the flame of those who had nothing left but rage. He was a man, perhaps, or maybe just a story born from the pain of millions. But stories are what survive when bodies perish. And in that way, Lazarus did what no man could. He rose again. Century after century, through every whisper, every song, every flicker of rebellion that refused to die. Some say the fire still burns. In certain places of North Carolina, when the air is thick and the cicadas go quiet, locals swear they see a glow rising from the earth. A soft orange shimmer, faint but steady. They say it's not lightning, not swamp gas, not imagination. They say it's Lazarus, still walking, still burning, still watching over the South that tried to forget him. The legend of Lazarus became eternal because it carried both vengeance and hope. Two sides of the same flame. For some, he was a murderer. For others, a savior. But for all, he was a reminder that even in the darkest soil, the spark of rebellion can never truly be extinguished. By the time the Civil War had ended and the smoke cleared over the southern fields, the name Lazarus had become something whispered again. Not out of fear, but reverence. The Union soldiers had gone home, the Confederacy had fallen, but the old scars of bondage still ran deep across the South. Freedom had come on paper, but not yet in the hearts of those who ruled. In that uneasy silence between emancipation and true equality, the legend of Lazarus returned, burning brighter, sharper, deadlier. The former enslaved carried his name like a secret code. To them, Lazarus was not just a man from the past, but a spirit that lived within every person who refused to bow. They spoke of him in spirituals and sermons, his fire disguised in faith. In churches built by freedmen, preachers would thunder, "Lazarus rose from the ashes, and so shall we!" And the congregation would cry back, "Amen!" But outside those walls, in the white towns and the broken plantations turned prisons, his name was still cursed. Southern newspapers in the 1870s mentioned him as a mythical Negro arsonist, using his legend to justify stricter control of freedmen. They blamed Lazarus's followers for every barn fire, every uprising rumor, every act of defiance. But what the papers didn't understand was that the myth itself had already become a kind of resistance. Invisible, uncontainable, passed down in stories, lullabies, and old songs. Among the freedmen, tales of Lazarus transformed with each telling. Some said he didn't die. Others said his soul became the flame that burned inside every black man who stood up against injustice. In Mississippi, sharecroppers sang a version of an old work song called "The Fire Walked North." Its verses told of a man who burned the chains off his brothers and vanished into the wind. The song spread across the Reconstruction South, echoing through the cotton fields, through broken shacks, through the hope and hunger of a new America trying to be born. In truth, Lazarus became what the people needed him to be. For the weary, he was courage. For the angry, he was vengeance. For the hopeful, he was proof that even the powerless could strike back. By the 1880s, the South was rebuilding, railroads rising, cities growing, but hate still festering beneath it all. Lynchings were public, justice was private, and the promise of freedom began to rot in the heat of oppression. And yet, in this cruel rebirth of old chains, whispers of Lazarus grew louder again. Freedmen who dared to resist the terror of night riders sometimes signed letters or graffiti with a single word: die. Lazarus. It was a name that made even the most violent men pause, because if he was truly a ghost, he was a ghost they could not hang. The white South tried to reclaim his story, rewriting him into something monstrous. A devil who seduced slaves into rebellion, a false prophet whose fire led only to ruin. Preachers thundered from pulpits that Lazarus's flame was the work of Satan. But what they didn't realize was that every warning made him more powerful. The myth worked like fire itself. The harder they tried to smother it, the faster it spread. Then came the Great Migration. Between 1910 and 1930, millions of African Americans fled the South, carrying their songs, memories, and legends north. In train stations and cramped boxcars, old men told children the story of Lazarus, the man who burned his masters to ashes and walked free through the flames. By the time those children grew up in Chicago, Detroit, and Harlem, they weren't telling it as a ghost story anymore. They told it as history. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance, men like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay, began to weave the imagery of fire, rebirth, and vengeance into their work. Though Lazarus's name rarely appeared directly, his spirit was there, in the poems about burning fields, in the jazz songs that spoke of rising from smoke, in the plays that told of black men who refused to die quietly. In 1928, a small pamphlet was circulated in Harlem titled, "The Gospel of Lazarus." It told of a preacher who said he had seen Lazarus in a dream, a tall man with hands of ash and eyes like coals. The preacher claimed Lazarus told him, "The South is still burning, and every man must be his own fire." It was banned in several southern states, but copies made their way underground. Through the early 20th century, the story of Lazarus lived in the shadows, half religion, half rebellion. When the civil rights movement began in the 1950s, older activists spoke of him as one of the first freedom fighters. In the Mississippi Delta, during voter registration drives, some volunteers wrote the word Lazarus in chalk on the back of church doors as a reminder: we've risen before, we'll rise again. Even Martin Luther King Jr., though a man of peace, understood the fire beneath the faith. In one of his early speeches, he said, "Freedom burns, and once the fire has been kindled in the heart of a man, no oppressor can quench it." He didn't mention Lazarus, but those who knew the legend smiled quietly when they heard the words. Over time, historians began to debate whether Lazarus had ever been real. Some claimed his story was inspired by a series of smaller revolts that took place across North Carolina in the 1830s and 40s. Others believed he was entirely myth, a creation of grief and hope fused into one. But even those who denied his existence could not deny his power. For in the end, Lazarus had become something larger than a man. He was a symbol that transcended fact, a figure who burned his way through centuries of silence and shame. His story didn't live in books or monuments, it lived in memory, in song, in the unspoken courage of those who carried his fire forward. By the late 20th century, artists and filmmakers began to rediscover the legend. An independent film in 1974 titled Ashes of the South portrayed Lazarus as both hero and monster, a man torn between justice and vengeance. In 1992, a folk musician from Durham recorded The Ballad of Lazarus with the haunting chorus. He lit the night, he burned their lies, he walked through flames with open eyes. He left no grave, no chains, no plea, only fire, and the will to be free. The song spread through college campuses and radio stations, reminding new generations that history's greatest acts of rebellion are often erased first and reborn later as legend. Even now, in the 21st century, the name Lazarus echoes through culture, in poems, art exhibits, and hidden corners of social media. Every time a protest sign burns, every time a voice rises against oppression, that old fire flickers again. Lazarus, whether man or myth, had become the eternal metaphor of rising, the embodiment of what it means to fight back even when the world insists you cannot. His fire never truly died. It simply passed from one generation's hands to another, quiet, unseen, waiting for the next soul brave enough to strike the match. By the dawn of the 21st century, the story of Lazarus had become a quiet echo in the pages of obscure history books and forgotten songs. Yet, like all powerful myths, it refused to die. Every generation finds its ghosts, and when America once again began to wrestle with its buried past, Lazarus's flame began to stir in the ashes. The digital age was supposed to erase old myths, but instead it gave them new life. On forums, blogs, and message boards dedicated to forgotten African American history, the name Lazarus began to reappear. At first, it was whispered in academic corners, discussions of slave revolts, unrecorded acts of rebellion, and the psychology of resistance. But soon it escaped those walls. A few artists, historians, and activists started referring to Lazarus not as a figure of vengeance, but as a symbol of truth reclaimed. The fire of justice reignited. In 2005, a young North Carolina filmmaker named Devin Cole stumbled upon a mention of Lazarus in a 19th-century court record. It referred vaguely to the Negro called Lazarus who was put to death for crimes of fire and rebellion. Intrigued, Cole spent years tracking down fragments of letters, sermons, and plantation records. In 2009, he released a documentary titled The Lazarus Fire, America's Forgotten Slave Revolt. The film didn't just tell the story of the man who burned his masters alive. It explored how history itself had buried such stories, how entire chapters of resistance were erased to protect the illusion of Southern nobility. The documentary sparked outrage and fascination alike. Critics accused Cole of glorifying violence. Others hailed the film as a long-overdue truth-telling, a confrontation with the moral hypocrisy of a nation built on both freedom and slavery. In interviews, Cole said something that would later become iconic: Lazarus isn't about revenge. He's about memory, and memory always burns. Those words lit a fuse in the public imagination. Suddenly, Lazarus's image began appearing in murals across cities like Atlanta, Durham, and New Orleans. Artists painted him as a towering figure, shrouded in smoke, holding a torch that illuminated chains melting in the fire. The art carried both anger and pride, a call to remember that even in the darkest centuries, enslaved people had fought back blood and burned for freedom long before the Civil War ever came. By 2012, amid growing social tension and the rise of movements demanding racial justice, the story of Lazarus evolved again. Activists began invoking his name in rallies and protests, not as a literal hero but as a metaphor for uprising, a symbol of black endurance and defiance. Social media carried hashtags like "Rise like Lazarus" and "The Fire Still Burns," linking past and present struggles in one shared narrative of survival. For many young Americans who felt disillusioned with sanitized history, Lazarus represented something raw, unfiltered, and painfully true. He was proof that rebellion had always been part of the American story, that liberty had never been handed down, only wrestled free. Academics began taking notice. Howard University hosted a symposium titled The Lazarus Paradox: Violence, Memory, and Freedom in American History. Scholars debated whether the myth of Lazarus glorified brutality or simply mirrored the brutality inflicted upon enslaved people. Some argued he was a psychological necessity, a figure who gave the oppressed a language for rage when no justice existed. One historian summarized it best: Lazarus did not invent fire. He inherited it. He turned it back on those who thought they owned the light. Meanwhile, in popular culture, the legend found new forms. A hip-hop artist from Raleigh released a track titled "Ashes Don't Die," sampling the crackle of flames behind verses about systemic oppression and rebirth. The chorus repeated like a chant, "We burn so we live, we rise so we remember." The song went viral, reaching millions of listeners who had never heard of the original Lazarus but understood what he represented. Then came the murals, sprawling, defiant pieces of street art that appeared during the height of national protests. One painting, in particular, became iconic. It showed Lazarus standing barefoot in a field of ashes, the American flag torn and burning behind him, and from the smoke rose the faces of countless nameless ancestors. The caption beneath read simply, "He burned for freedom. We breathe for it." This visual transformation marked a turning point. Lazarus was no longer confined to dusty archives. He had entered the realm of living art and cultural mythology. His fire now burned not just for revenge, but for reckoning, a force that demanded America to confront what it had tried so long to forget. Yet with this rebirth came controversy. Conservative commentators decried the use of Lazarus's image, calling it historical revisionism and the glorification of racial violence. Some even attempted to dismiss him as a fabrication, folklore invention of the radical left, but their outrage only spread the story further. Every argument, every op-ed, every attempt to discredit him, all of it fed the flame. By 2020, the name Lazarus had become a symbol of both resistance and reflection. Protesters carried signs quoting his supposed last words, "If I burn, let it be for the living." Those words, though historically unverified, became gospel to many who felt suffocated by cycles of injustice in classrooms. Teachers began using his story to teach about the psychological dimensions of oppression and revolt. Students debated the morality of his actions. Was he a hero or a monster? The answer they discovered was both, and that duality was precisely the point. Modern America, in many ways, mirrored the contradictions of Lazarus himself. A country that prided itself on liberty still fought over whose freedom truly mattered. And just as Lazarus had turned his oppressors' fire upon them, today's generations found themselves facing the same moral heat. How far must one go to confront injustice, and what must be sacrificed in doing so? As time went on, Lazarus became less a man and more an idea. Writers called him the nation's buried conscience, while artists described him as the spirit of America's reckoning. His flame had traveled through centuries, shifting from vengeance to awareness, from blood to truth. Today, in the quiet spaces between art and memory, his fire still glows. In the rhythm of protest chants, in the brushstrokes of murals, in the defiant poetry of those who refuse to be erased. The Lazarus of modern America is not the same man who burned 9 masters alive. He is something larger, a mirror held up to the nation's soul. His vengeance has evolved into vision, his fire into enlightenment. He reminds us that every generation must face its own burning, and that sometimes destruction is not the opposite of creation, but the beginning of it. And so, the legend continues, not in whispers now, but in songs and screens and the steady heartbeat of a people who have learned to carry the fire without letting it consume them. Because in every struggle for justice, in every voice that refuses silence, in every soul that rises from the ashes, Lazarus lives again. By the time the world entered the 3rd decade of the 21st century, the legend of Lazarus, once confined to whispers in plantation ruins and old Southern records, had escaped the borders of the United States. His story, once seen as uniquely American, began to resonate with people from continents who knew their own scars of oppression, colonization, and rebellion. What began as the tale of a North Carolina slave who burned 9 masters alive transformed into a universal parable of rage, resistance, and rebirth. It started with art. The first global spark came from London in 2021 when a Ghanaian-born painter named Kwesi Ofori unveiled a haunting exhibition titled Lazarus, Fire in the Blood. Each canvas depicted not just the enslaved man, but his spirit reincarnated through different eras. A miner in South Africa's apartheid years, a woman in colonial India setting fire to her abuser's mansion, a freedom fighter in Haiti clutching a torch of liberation. The message was unmistakable. Lazarus was not just one man, but the embodiment of every oppressed soul who refused to stay silent. The exhibition became an international sensation. Critics called it a resurrection of resistance, while one London reviewer wrote, "Ofori paints with ashes, the ashes of history itself." Soon, murals inspired by the show began appearing in Lagos, Johannesburg, Kingston, and Rio de Janeiro. Each portrayed Lazarus differently, sometimes as a man, sometimes as a spirit, sometimes as a collective of hands reaching through fire. In each version, the flame was the same, pure, defiant, unending. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, a group of historians began uncovering parallels between Lazarus's story and similar revolts during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They noted that enslaved people across Jamaica, Barbados, and Haiti had also used fire as a weapon of freedom, burning fields, homes, and symbols of their bondage. For them, Lazarus was more than an American ghost. He was part of a global lineage of fiery resistance. By 2023, his story reached Europe through film. A French-Nigerian director released Ashes of Freedom, a movie loosely inspired by Lazarus's legend but set in a fictional Caribbean island. The film followed a slave named Issa who burned down a plantation after witnessing unspeakable cruelty, then vanished into the mountains, only to become a myth generations later. The film won awards for its powerful storytelling, and audiences worldwide connected with its central truth that sometimes freedom demands an unbearable cost. What made Lazarus's legend endure, even across cultures, was not just the violence of his act, but the moral fire behind it. He wasn't remembered as a killer seeking chaos, but as a man forced to commit an unforgivable act, because forgiveness had long been denied to him. People who had endured systems of exploitation, from sweatshop workers in Asia to indigenous activists in Latin America, saw themselves in that reflection. In Nairobi, a poet named Wanjiru Mwangi wrote a collection titled, "We Burn to Be Seen." One of her most quoted lines read, "They call it vengeance. We call it remembering ourselves." Those words captured the essence of the Lazarus myth's global rebirth. It was no longer about revenge, but reclamation. Soon, academic circles around the world began comparing Lazarus to figures from other liberation struggles: the Maroons of Jamaica, the Mau Mau fighters of Kenya, the slave rebels of Bahia, Brazil. Everywhere there were echoes of fire, resistance through destruction, rebirth through ruin. But as with every powerful story, Lazarus's global rise invited distortion. Some groups began using his image for darker purposes, extremist movements that glorified violence without context. His name appeared on graffiti linked to radical collectives who claimed to be purifying society through fire. The myth, once born of righteous pain, risked being hijacked by those who sought chaos instead of justice. In 2024, scholars, activists, and artists convened a conference in Atlanta titled, "Who Owns the Fire?" The event explored how symbols of rebellion often outgrow their origins, how a story meant to honor one man's defiance could, in careless hands, ignite something far more dangerous. One speaker, a Jamaican historian, offered a sobering reflection. Every flame carries two destinies, one to light the way, another to consume. We must choose which Lazarus we keep alive. The discussions helped redirect the global narrative. Lazarus was reframed once again, not as an icon of burning, but of awakening. Artists emphasized his transformation from fire to light, from destruction to illumination. The same image that once represented rebellion was now used to symbolize truth emerging from centuries of suppression. The most striking example came from Brazil. A massive public art installation titled, "The Phoenix of Chains," was unveiled in Salvador de Bahia, a city that once served as a center of the transatlantic slave trade. It featured a towering figure made of charred steel and recycled metal, rising from flames sculpted in bronze. The artist, a descendant of enslaved Africans, said Lazarus burned his past to make room for a future. We build from his ashes. The sculpture became a pilgrimage site, a place where people left letters, poems, and offerings honoring those who fought and died unnamed in the long struggle for liberation. As Lazarus's legend evolved, it became clear that he had transcended identity, geography, and even time. His story no longer belonged to the American South, nor even to Black history alone. It had become a shared myth of humanity's unending fight for dignity. In every part of the world where injustice still breathed, Lazarus's shadow could be felt, not as fear, but as fire waiting to awaken. In classrooms in Ghana, Haiti, and the U.S., students began studying him alongside historical figures like Nat Turner and Toussaint Louverture. Documentaries revisited his story, weaving it with modern struggles against racial and economic oppression. He had become, in essence, a language, one spoken in art, activism, and memory. Today, when artists speak of Lazarus's fire, they don't mean literal flames. They mean the spark that refuses to die, the voice that keeps speaking when all others are silenced. His fire became metaphor, his vengeance became vision, and his death became resurrection. And perhaps that is why the world clings to him still, because every generation faces its own kind of plantation, systems built to cage, control, and silence. And every generation must find its Lazarus, the one who dares to strike the match not to destroy the world, but to demand that it finally see. So the fire travels on, from Carolina's fields to Rio's favelas, from Harlem walls to Ghana's galleries. A chain of light linking centuries, carrying pain, truth, and defiance in its glow. Lazarus no longer burns for revenge. He burns for remembrance. He burns for every soul who refuses to bow. And across oceans, that fire keeps whispering one eternal truth. The living can only be free when the forgotten are remembered. By the time the world crossed into the 2030s, the name Lazarus no longer lived only in books or whispered stories passed down through Southern families. It lived in screens, archives, hashtags, and code. What had begun as a silenced piece of American history, a forgotten slave rebellion erased by fear, was reborn through the most modern form of rebellion imaginable. A digital resurrection. It began quietly. A graduate student at Howard University named Elijah Green, researching forgotten Black uprisings, stumbled upon fragmented plantation ledgers and diary pages in a private collection in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hidden in those brittle pages were the initials LOO, Lazarus Whitmore, along with mentions of the Night of Fire, 9 lost souls, and a plantation, purified by its own sin. Elijah Cross referenced the fragments with census and church records. And for the first time, a pattern emerged that aligned with the oral legend of a slave who burned his masters alive. When Elijah shared his findings online, it ignited something extraordinary. Across the world, people began piecing together details, documents, and testimonies from archives long ignored. A collective digital investigation formed, a global network of historians, descendants, artists, and coders who called themselves the Lazarus Circle. Their mission: to restore every erased piece of the story, not through revenge but through remembrance. The Lazarus Circle used artificial intelligence to reconstruct plantation maps, slave registers, and even the fire's possible timeline. With each data point, Lazarus's story grew sharper, no longer just folklore but a forensic reconstruction of rebellion. Through deep learning restoration, they brought old handwriting into legibility, decoded water-damaged texts, and uncovered letters written by neighboring plantation owners who described the incident in fear and disbelief. One letter dated August 1834 reads simply, "He has turned the land against us. The night burns still in my dreams." That letter became a viral symbol. Artists used its words in murals, poets in verses, musicians in songs. Within months, "They Burn Still" began trending worldwide, becoming not a slogan of violence, but of truth reclaimed. By 2033, a virtual museum titled "The Fire That Spoke" was launched in partnership with major universities and cultural archives. It used 3D environments to recreate the Whitmore plantation in haunting detail. Not as glorification, but confrontation. Visitors could walk digitally through slave quarters, hear recorded testimonies of descendants, and see the fire spread room by room, narrated through Lazarus's own words as imagined from journals and oral accounts. The project didn't just preserve history, it revived empathy. Millions logged on, schools held digital field trips. Activists, educators, and families visited to honor those who had suffered in silence. But the story didn't end with education, it evolved. Musicians sampled the digital museum soundscape, the crackling of fire, the rhythmic chains, the heartbeat beneath it all, creating songs that climbed global charts. Each lyric echoed a truth, that justice denied in one century could still demand to be heard in the next. A filmmaker from Nigeria released Lazarus, The Fire in Code, a documentary showing how technology, often used for distraction, had instead become a tool for ancestral resurrection. The film followed digital artists who used augmented reality to project Lazarus's story onto city walls worldwide. When the app was opened, fire seemed to climb the facades, not to destroy but to illuminate. It turned the whole world into a living memorial. Then came something even more profound. The Lazarus AI project. Elijah Green, working with technologists from Ghana, Brazil, and France, trained an AI model on historical texts, oral traditions, and enslaved narratives. Its purpose was to simulate how Lazarus might have spoken, not to fictionalize, but to give voice to someone denied one. The AI could respond to questions about history, morality, and faith, using language inspired by 19th century diction and Black spiritual tradition. When journalists asked Elijah if it was ethical to give an algorithm the voice of the dead, he replied, "The world gave them silence for centuries. Giving them speech isn't exploitation, it's restoration." That phrase, "it's restoration," became the slogan for the movement that followed. People began calling this new wave of remembrance digital liberation theology, the belief that technology could finally serve the oppressed, not the powerful. By 2035, the Lazarus AI had become part of classrooms, exhibits, and even global memorials. When asked, "Why did you set the fire?" it answered, "Because no one else would see the smoke unless I lit it." That line shook millions. It wasn't just historical fiction anymore. It was philosophical confrontation. What does justice look like when the system itself is built on forgetting? What is morality in a world that rewards obedience over truth? Lazarus's digital ghost forced those questions into modern consciousness. Soon, digital poets used his words in holographic performances. Activists quoted him in marches demanding reparations and justice for racial crimes. His name became not a threat, but a symbol of awakening. The embodiment of a truth that could no longer be buried under comfort or denial. Even in the corporate world, his story reached unexpected corners. A tech company designed a software algorithm named Lazarus Protocol, dedicated to recovering deleted or hidden data, an ironic yet fitting tribute to a man whose history had been erased and reborn. And in 2036, when the last known descendant of the Whitmore family publicly apologized and donated the plantation land for a memorial garden, the world seemed to close a circle. On that land, descendants of the enslaved gathered with candles, singing spirituals beneath the same trees that once hid the fires of rebellion. The memorial plaque read, "This soil remembers. It burned once, not in hatred, but in truth. Here stood a man who refused to die in silence. Here began the fire that still speaks." In that moment, the line between past and present dissolved. Lazarus was no longer a figure of vengeance nor a myth of destruction. He had become an eternal teacher, a living reminder that history cannot heal until it is faced. Every October 12th, people now light candles or digital flames under the global hashtag "The Fire Still Speaks," a day of remembrance for all enslaved people who resisted oppression in any form. From churches to classrooms, from protests to online forums, his name is whispered not as terror, but as truth. And as the last lines of a new poem by Wanjiru Mwangi declare, Lazarus was not born to kill, he was born to be heard. And when the world burned, it finally listened. Through data, art, and memory, Lazarus became immortal, not as a killer, but as the echo of every silenced soul demanding to be remembered. The fire that once consumed 9 masters now illuminates millions. The rebellion that once hid in shadows now shines on every screen. And Lazarus, the forgotten slave, lives on, not in chains, not in vengeance, but in the infinite light of truth reborn.